I'm going to, enough of me. I want to read Milton's, aka Johnny's, bio for all of you who are not familiar with him. I am a black speculative fiction writer and owner of MV Media LLC, a small publishing company specializing in science fiction, fantasy, and sword and soul. You have to explain that sword and soul to me. MV Media's mission is to provide speculative fiction books that represent people of color in a positive manner. I'm the author of 20 novels and short story collections. My most recent, The Sword and Soul Adventure, Eda Blessed too. Eda Blessed too. I'm also contributing author to Black Panther, the series, the movie series. Tales of Wakanda, published by Marvel and Titan Books, and co-author of Hadithi and the State of Black Speculative Fiction with Eugene Bacon. I'm editor and co-editor of 11 anthologies: Spy Funk, Terminus, Tales of Black Fantastic from the ATL, Cyberfunk, The City, Dark Universe, and Dark Universe, The Bright Empire of Gene Peterson, Griots, a Sword and Soul anthology, and Griot, Sisters of the Spear with Charles R. Saunders, the Kikanga anthology, Steampunk and Diesel Funk with Balagon Ojitadi. My work also has been featured in Black Power, the superhero anthology, and Rococoa, published by Roaring Lions Productions, Skelos 2, The Journey of Weird Fiction and Dark Fantasy, Steampunk Writers Around the World, published by Luna Press, Hiroka, Dragon Eaters, published by First Persade Press, Bass Reeves Frontier, Marshall Volume 2, and Slay, Stories of the Vampire Noir. Balagon Ojitadi and I won the 2014 Urban Action Showcase Award for Best Script for our screenplay, Ngolo. My story, The Swarm, was nominated for the 2017 British Science Fiction Association Award for short fiction, and my story, Carnival, was nominated for the 2020 British Science Fiction Association Award for short story. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you all to meet Mr. Milton Johnny Davis. Now, I've interviewed Johnny a couple of times on my show, and so you all have some kind of a background for his writing. First of all, it is a hobby of his because by career he's a pharmacist and
chemist.
Or a chemist. Okay, I'm sorry, a pharmacist who does chemistry. A chemist. But it just goes to show we all have passions, and his passions has surfaced from getting a college education and having a career as a chemist. Writing has always been a passion of his. Share with everyone how it came to be your love for wanting to put words on paper and expressing any kind of mental and emotional thought about any subject matter.
Well, writing is something that I did, and I never really thought about a lot of it. It was just something that I did growing up. It was stuff that I would do when I felt like doing it. It wasn't like something, sometimes I talk to a lot of artists and they say they've always wanted to write, something they always wanted to do. With me, it was kind of like I did it when I felt like doing it. If there was something that hit me that way, I'd write a story about it and wouldn't think a lot about it. In the 5th grade, I wrote a play, turned it in to my teacher, and they said, oh, this is great, and we ended up doing it for the PTA. But, you know, again, it was something that I never really thought deeply about until I was in college. And my instructor, my English instructor, Anna Holloway, the first essay I wrote in her class, she said, I need you to come by my office. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay. Did she think I plagiarized something? So I went by her office, and she said, what are you doing majoring in chemistry? You should be a writer. And I said, well, writers don't make any money. And I'm here to say that, to vouch for that to this day. No, but so she it was kind of her fault that I got into science fiction and fantasy because she was trying to get me into writing. So she really introduced me to science fiction and fantasy. Up to that point, I just read current event stuff and history. I'm a big history buff. And she introduced me to people like Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and Heinlein, all those people, and I started reading this stuff. And then she said, well, I think you could write something like that. So she challenged me to write stories, and I would write these stories, and I would give them to her, and she would evaluate them and tell me what she thought about them and stuff like that. So that kind of got me into writing on a regular basis. Graduated from college, wrote some stories, submitted them in. If you're an author, you go from where you get the form rejections where they don't really read your story to the point where they actually read your stories and they give you some critique. So I got into that point, and then life happened. Got married, had kids, stuff like that. So when I turned 45, I kind of asked myself, what was it that you've always wanted to do that you haven't done yet? And writing came up. And at the time, independent writing was becoming to be very popular and stuff, self-publishing and stuff, So I said, well, let's try that, because I didn't want to have to deal with editors and agents and people like that. I had a certain thing I wanted to write. I wanted to write about black people. And when I looked at the market, it seemed like at the time publishers weren't really interested in that, especially when it came to science fiction and fantasy. And that's why I became a self-publisher. Okay. And that was like 2005. In 2008, that's when I started MV Media, and it's been 15 years this year that we've been doing it.
Now, explain the difference to us, the difference between Hollywood science fiction and what you have delved into from a science fiction standpoint. Because, one is probably more entertainment versus you delving into a story with characters and a story to tell.
Well, I think, and it depends on the author, really. With some people, I tend to write more toward action-adventure type stuff. I'm not the kind of writer all the time that's going to leave you thinking about the deeper meanings of life. If I do that, I apologize, and I promise not to do it again. but I think the difference between writing as an author and what you see in Hollywood is that, when you're dealing with Hollywood, you're trying to create something that's going to appeal to the largest group of people possible. So you're going to end up as an author, and I know friends of mine that have gone through the process, and I'm currently going through the process in some aspects, is that when you write a story, the first thing they start looking at is, okay, what do we need to do to change this story to make sure it's going to appeal to a broader audience? Because most of us write for a specific audience. Who do we need to put into this book? What's the demographic we're trying to appeal to, and different things like that. So when you get to that Hollywood level, you're dealing with a whole different focus of who your story is for and what that story is about. And I think that's the major difference. There was a friend of mine, Nadia Okorafor, who was here recently, and she was just talking about that process. And her question was, why isn't what I write enough? And that's one of the major issues. When we wrote for Black Panther Tales of Wakanda, we were told specifically that we could not write stories based on the movie world, the MCU, the Marvel universe. Our stories had to be based on the comic book universe, and which are different. The stories are different. The background of Black Panther is different when it comes from the comic book. I'm not a big comic book person. I had to actually research Black Panther and read comic books. I have friends of mine who were big comic book fans, and I talked to them about it. And the story I chose, the character I chose to write about, Bashenga, was the first Black Panther. And the reason I chose him was because his story was similar to what I write in Sword and Soul. And so it was easier for me to tell that story. And my story was the only story that was sent in that was rejected, and first off. And it wasn't because it wasn't a good story, but it was because I talked about something that they didn't want us to talk about as authors. I was talking about how actually the metal vibranium came to be on Earth. And I had imagined that, how I thought it would happen, and they said, no, we don't want you to touch that. We want you to leave that alone. So I had to just kind of cut that part out of the story and just tell the story from that point forward. Fortunately, it didn't affect the story I was telling, but that's some of the stuff that you deal with when you're working for a traditional publisher or on a Hollywood level, because now you've got to pass their muster on what you can and can't write about.
certainly they wouldn't want you to cross that line of copyright infringement or taking their character out of context, I would imagine.
Yeah, you understand from the beginning. They tell you this is going to be the deal. Whatever you write is going to belong to us.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Formula.
Exactly. So that's what you're getting into when you do it and stuff, and you understand that. So that's what you do.
In some of your science fiction black character writings, has there ever been, are there characters that you write that are either male or female in terms of the heroine or the hero dynamic?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I do it. I mean, I'm main thing I'm trying to do is represent black characters. There are stories where I say where the characters have to be black, and there are stories where the people happen to be black.
Okay.
And I deal with all different types of black people. Okay. Whatever the story calls for, that's going to be the main character. Sometimes there have been some situations where I may be writing a story that's inspired by a piece of art, and that's going to determine the main character. But there are other stories where that particular situation requires me to talk about a certain type of character and tell it a certain way. And sometimes in the process of writing the story, I may have imagined the character one way, but as I start to tell the story, the character kind of becomes different than how I saw them. Okay. There's a point that authors talk about where the stories and the characters take over. And I used to think that was silly until I started writing on a regular basis. But it is true that once you develop these characters and their personalities and their situations, the characters start to speak to you. And you're basically just following the story that they're telling. My only caveat is that I have already figured out how the story is going to end. So when the characters start going where I don't want them to go, I just kind of knock them back over here. I kind of like that's not the ending that I want. So I have to do that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't really, to me, it doesn't. I don't go into any situation saying there's going to be a certain type of character. It just depends on what the story requires for me, and from that standpoint.
I know as a child myself, I was caught up into the Hollywood versions of science fiction and the Superman heroes and things like that as a kid. And the thoughts of wanting to put a towel around my neck and jumping off the roof and fun. Or has any of your own childhood memories of fantasy, were those thoughts any parts of any characters that you wrote about? I mean, did you put any input into, if you were a superhero, how would you be, and did some of that mentality become a part of some of the characters?
The only place where that really affected me was when I wrote my Sword and Soul. Sword and Soul is basically sword and sorcery based on African culture. Okay. And I read comic books, but I wasn't really deep into them like my friends were. Okay. But the one character that I did read about that I got into was Conan, because Conan was supposed to be historically based, and that was the one that really got to me. So Robert E. Howard was an anthropology major, and when you read the Conan books and you see the areas that he refers to in the books, they're actually places that existed in Europe, pre-ancient periods and different things like that. So when I decided to sit down and start writing, I determined that I wanted to write stuff like that, but I wanted to write it from an African perspective. Okay. Because I wanted to, at the time, just like you, I mean, I'm seeing these characters, but I'm not seeing me in these characters. Right. And so I wanted to write a story that was, I would say, like Conan, but not like Conan. Okay. I wanted his story to come from African history and culture, and I wanted that to be the whole background to it. And that's where my first book, Meji, came from, and that's where my book series, Changa Safari, came from having that the African historical background and developing those type of characters.
From a publishing standpoint, your product has gone worldwide. Share with the audience here some of the successes you've had in publishing some of your works worldwide.
Well, that's all about social media. Social media gives you that reach everywhere, and as you write your stories and you put them online, people aren't just seeing them in the United States; they're seeing them everywhere. A perfect example is when I wrote my the second book, Changa Safari. And in Changa Safari, Changa is traveling around the world having all these different adventures. And in one of the books, I have him, he's in India. And so, but at the time it wasn't called him India, but that region. So when I let that book out and I'm checking where my sales are on Amazon, I noticed that particular book, I got a lot of interest in India. Because, people saw this and it's like, hey, this is something about, about our country and our culture. Let's read about it. Same thing with Changa Safari. When I first let it out, I got hit up from a guy from Australia who was like, when I first saw this book, I was like, this isn't real, So we looked and saw the history, and he found all about the history of East Africa, Swahili city-states, and their relationship with Asia and stuff. So to me, it's like, people would tell you in the beginning, okay, you're a black writer, you're writing about black stuff. Yes, I am. My main audience are black people. But a good book is a good book.
Right.
And what I've learned over the years is that, people will read a good book. Right. If it sounds good to them, they'll read it. And so I've got a big crossover audience because of that. Right. Because in the end, it's a good book. It's about people, I don't think we should have to explain that, because all of us have our own, our universal things as being people. Sure. And, and if people see that they feel like the plot is interesting, then they'll buy the book,
Right. Right. I mean, we as people of color have been forced to, lack of a better word, forced to read about other people's lives and other people's adventures all of our lives.
Exactly.
Played out in Hollywood, played out in our libraries around the U.S. Talk to me about your peers, your African American author peers. Is there a vibrant number of authors that may meet for whatever reasons together to exchange ideas or to interact? Anything of that sort that you know of that you are either involved with or you're aware of?
Yeah, I think that was one of the main things about social media too. It allowed black people who were into science fiction and fantasy to find each other. Right. When we first got into it and we were running into people, I kept hearing the same thing over and over. Black people saying, I thought I was the only person into science fiction and fantasy. I didn't know there were other black people into it. So these communities sprang up on online. One of the first ones I was in was called Black Science Fiction Society. Mm-hmm. We started our own one called the State of Black Science Fiction. Mm-hmm. We have a local group of black writers that we call Atlanta Futurism. Matter of fact, 2 of them are in the building today, right now, and so it's a strong community, okay. And it goes from a lot of us are indie authors. We write and publish ourselves. Mm-hmm. A lot of us are traditionally published authors, and some of us are both. We write, we do our own stuff, plus we publish in other with other publishers and stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's a vibrant community, and it's growing. It's funny because I have to sometimes I realize how long I've been doing this, because I've been doing it like for 15 years, and sometimes I'll run into somebody that'll come and say, "Man, I read your book when I was like 10 years old," and they're 25 now, and I'm like, okay, I'm like, man, am I old? But to see that development and to see that growth. In the beginning, we were doing a lot of explaining. I would have to talk into detail about what I was writing about and how it related to people. But recently, when I'm doing events now, I just see people that just walk up and they just go right to the book. So I don't have to explain anything. I just talk about the book itself. I don't have to talk about what Sword and Soul is and what steampunk is. They just walk up, they see the books, they're interested in buying them, and they buy them. So it's been nice to see, the evolution of it.
Are you or any of your contemporaries working as a whole in nurturing young writers or young folk who are interested in wanting to become writers, and y'all have any impact in nurturing their desire to write?
Oh yeah. When we first started, we were very active in the community. We actually did a thing at the Wren's Nest one day where we actually had young writers come in, and we gave them an assignment to write. And then we let them get up in front of everybody and read what they wrote and stuff. We went around while we were writing them, and if they had any questions about plot or different things like that. And actually today, it's funny, today I got an email from someone who's doing a seminar at Wofford College. and they just read a book that I had a story in, and they asked me if I would do a virtual presentation because they were working with students from 8th grade to 12th grade, and they wanted to know if I would come and do a presentation to talk to them about world building and different things like that. And of course I said yeah, so there's always opportunities to do that. And that's one thing I don't turn down. If it's an opportunity to speak to young writers, I never turn those down.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah, because they need the guidance of experienced African American writers, and here again, if they can partner up with folk like yourself that are entrenched into the dynamics of literature writing, then that probably helps them, I'm sure. And then, you know, with the advent of technology, you are touching people that you don't know if you've touched through technology, and I'm sure that's a big tool for you and your contemporaries to utilize technology.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah. So that leads us up to Muscadine.
Muscadine.
your latest publication, and I will let you take over at this point and talk about your latest venture.
Okay. Well, Muscadine Wine is kind of a collection of stories that's been coming for a long time. When I first started writing, I deliberately tried not to write stories based on my own family, my own upbringing. I just didn't want to do that.
Okay.
I tried to stay away from it, but I found myself doing it over the years and stuff.
It would be hard for you not to. I would.
Yeah, you know, it's certain things that I wanted to talk about,
Right.
and like one of the stories in here, Undercurrents, actually wrote that story when Vic and I were in Jekyll Island right before my son was born, and just being in that atmosphere kind of sparked the story. Grandpa's Hands, the one I'm going to read today, is based on the only conversation I ever had with my grandfather. You know, and then there's other stories in there that, you know, as those times came, they just, you know, it's just things that you wanted to talk about, but not necessarily talk about in the way that they occurred. I didn't want to do that because I didn't want to have one of those stories where it's like, you know, the names have been changed to protect the innocent. You know, I haven't written that kind of story yet. You know, that kind of thing, you know. But I wanted to reflect, you know, growing up in Southwest Georgia, living in I lived in Georgia all my life, except for first when I was born in North Carolina, and growing up during the 60s and the 70s in Georgia, in the South. I think it was a unique experience. And I've never really seen anybody talk about it in literature. I see a lot of people talk about the 40s. I see people talk about the 60s and the 70s from an urban standpoint, like New York City or Chicago and Detroit. But I don't see a lot of people talking about growing up in the South where this stuff was happening and being affected by what was happening during that time. But at the same time, just being a kid growing up, you know. So what I did with Muscadine Wine is that I took some of them are experiences that come from my life, but I kind of gave them a fantastic twist. Some of them are more grounded in nonfiction, and some of them are more general about being black and being in the South in different time periods. Like I'm really fascinated in that time period after World War I. Because a lot of black soldiers went to another country for the first time. And that was the first time they realized that they didn't need to be treated like they were being treated.
Right.
And they came back from Europe with a whole different sense of self.
Right.
And and it's not a coincidence that the revival of the Klan happened at the same time.
Sure.
You know.
By design.
Yeah. So being able to touch on stuff like that and talk about stuff like that is kind of the reasons why I wrote this collection of stories.